The playground was crowded that Saturday afternoon, full of the ordinary noise of a spring day, children shrieking on the swings, a dog barking somewhere near the fence, an ice cream truck circling the block with its tinny music looping over and over. I was sitting on a bench beside my son Daniel, watching my 7-month-old granddaughter Ivy squirm happily in her stroller, and I did what any grandfather does without thinking twice. I reached down, unbuckled the little strap across her chest, and lifted her up into my arms. "Dad, don't." Rachel's voice cut through the playground noise sharper than I expected, and she was across the grass in 4 quick strides, her hand already extended toward the baby, before I'd even settled Ivy against my shoulder. "I've got her, Harold. I'll take her." I froze, my granddaughter's small weight still warm against my chest, her tiny fist already curling around the collar of my jacket the way babies do instinctively, and I looked at my daughter-in-law's face and saw something I hadn't quite let myself name before that moment. She didn't trust me. Not with germs, not with the sun being too strong, or the wind being too cold, or any of the polite, deflecting reasons parents give when they don't want to say the real thing out loud. She simply didn't want her daughter in my arms, in public, where people could see. I handed Ivy back without a word. What else was there to do? Daniel looked uncomfortable, glancing between his wife and his father, saying nothing, the way sons often say nothing when they've learned, somewhere along the way, that staying quiet is easier than choosing a side. "She's just particular about who holds her outside," Rachel said afterward, not quite meeting my eyes, folding the moment into something smaller and more manageable. "You understand?" I said I understood. I did not understand. Not really. Not that day. What Rachel didn't know, what nobody in that family had ever thought to ask a 76-year-old man who kept mostly to himself, who preferred quiet evenings and rarely spoke about his younger years, was that the same hands she'd just pulled her daughter away from had once, 51 years earlier, carried a dying 20-year-old soldier across 400 yards of open rice paddy under machine gun fire, and had never once let go until they reached the medevac helicopter. Those hands had earned a Purple Heart that sat, unpolished and rarely mentioned, in a cigar box in my closet. And one of the men those hands had saved, on a morning in March of 1971, was a young private named Thomas Whitmore, the man who 40 years later would become Rachel's father. My name is Harold Ness, and for most of my adult life I have been, to nearly everyone who meets me, an unremarkable retired postal worker who likes fishing and doesn't say much at family gatherings. That reputation was not an accident. I built it, brick by brick, over 5 decades, because the alternative, talking about who I was before I became that quiet man, was more than I was willing to carry into ordinary conversation. I was drafted in 1969, 20 years old, working construction in Ohio, with no particular plan for my life beyond finishing out the summer. 18 months later, I was a squad medic with the 1st Cavalry Division, patching wounds in triple canopy jungle with hands that shook so badly the first few weeks that I had to press them flat against my own thighs before I could thread a suture. You learn quickly, in that kind of war, which parts of yourself you can afford to keep, and which parts you have to set down if you want to survive long enough to go home. I set down a great deal. I came home in 1972, a different man than the one who left, and like most men of my generation who returned from that particular war, I did not talk about it. Not to my wife, not to my son, and certainly not to strangers at playgrounds who had already decided, based on nothing at all, what kind of man I must be. I married my wife Carol in 1974. I raised my son Daniel in a quiet house in a quiet town, and I worked 32 years for the Postal Service, delivering other people's mail with a steadiness that people mistook for simplicity, when really it was the deepest kind of discipline, the discipline of a man who had once held another man's intestines in place with his own bare hands, and had decided, afterward, that the rest of his life would be lived as gently and as unremarkably as possible. Carol passed 6 years ago. Daniel married Rachel 2 years after that, and Ivy arrived the following spring, and I found myself, at 76, Once again a quiet man on the edge of a family's life, watching from a respectful distance, never quite certain how much space I was allowed to take up. I want to tell you about one morning because it explains everything that came after, and because I have told almost no one this story in 51 years. March the 9th, 1971. Our platoon was moving through a valley outside a village whose name I will not say aloud, because some names deserve to stay quiet even in a story like this one. We walked into an ambush at first light, small arms fire from the tree line, then mortars, and within 90 seconds 3 men were down in open ground with no cover between them and the enemy position. One of them was Private Thomas Whitmore, 19 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania, a boy who had shown me a photograph of his girlfriend just 2 nights before and asked, with the particular earnestness of a 19-year-old, whether I thought she'd wait for him. He'd taken shrapnel across his lower back and leg, and he was screaming in the way wounded men scream when the pain hasn't yet been dulled by shock, and he was 400 yards from any cover at all. I don't remember deciding to go get him. I remember being on my feet, and I remember the sound the ground made when rounds hit near my boots, and I remember Whitmore's weight across my shoulders, heavier than any 19-year-old should have been, and I remember the particular, endless quality of 400 yards when you're carrying a man who is bleeding through your shirt and screaming your name because it's the only word he has left in him. I took 2 rounds that morning, one through the meat of my left forearm, one that grazed my ribs and left a scar I still see every time I get out of the shower. I don't remember either impact happening. I remember only Whitmore's voice, and the helicopter blades getting louder, and setting him down on the stretcher and telling him, with more confidence than I actually had, that his girlfriend was absolutely going to wait for him. She did, as it turned out. He married her 3 years later. I received the Purple Heart for that morning, along with a bronze star with a V device that I have shown to exactly 4 people in 51 years. I carried 2 other men out of that valley over the following 11 months, and I do not say any of this to inflate my own importance in a story that, honestly, involves thousands of men who did far braver things and never came home to tell anyone about it. I say it because it is true, and because it is the thing my daughter-in-law didn't know standing on that playground, judging whether my hands were safe enough to hold her daughter. I never told Daniel any of this while he was growing up. It wasn't a dramatic choice, made in one deliberate moment. It was simply the accumulation of 1,000 smaller choices to redirect the conversation, to say, it was a long time ago, and change the subject, to let my son grow up believing his father's most notable trait was a preference for quiet fishing trips and an aversion to loud arguments. Carol knew the full story, of course. She was the only person who ever heard all of it on our porch one night in 1976, and she never once repeated it to anyone, not even to Daniel, because she understood, the way only a spouse of 42 years can understand, that the telling was mine to do, or not do, in my own time. I never found the right time. There is never, it turns out, a right time to tell your son that his quiet father once carried dying men across open ground under fire, because every ordinary Tuesday dinner feels like the wrong occasion for a story that heavy, and eventually decades pass, and the silence becomes its own kind of habit, difficult to break simply because it has existed for so long. So when Rachel entered our family, she inherited only the surface version of me, a retired mailman, a quiet old man who kept mostly to himself, pleasant enough but not particularly known, not particularly vouched for by anyone who could speak to his character beyond, he's always been quiet. I understood her caution, even as it wounded me, because caution about an unknown quantity is not unreasonable. I simply wished, quietly, that someone in the family had thought to tell her the fuller truth. 6 weeks after the playground, Daniel invited Rachel's parents over for dinner. The first time our 2 families would properly sit at the same table together, Ivy in her high chair between us, everyone making the careful, effortful conversation that new in-laws make when they're still learning the shape of each other. Rachel's father, Thomas Whitmore, was 74 years old, soft-spoken, with a slight limp in his left leg that I noticed the moment he walked through the door and immediately, involuntarily, filed away. the particular unevenness of a man whose leg had once taken shrapnel and never fully recovered its natural gait. I told myself it was nothing. Plenty of men his age walked with a limp. We shook hands. "Harold Ness," I said. Something crossed his face. Brief, almost imperceptible, gone before I could name it. He held onto my hand a half-second longer than a first handshake usually lasts. "Ness," he repeated, quietly, like he was testing the shape of the word against something buried deep in his memory. That's an unusual name to hear again." "Dad?" Rachel asked, noticing the pause. "You okay?" Thomas didn't answer her right away. He was still looking at me, at my left forearm specifically, where the sleeve of my shirt had ridden up slightly, exposing the old scar along the muscle. A scar that, to anyone else, might look like any old injury. But Thomas Whitmore had spent 11 months in the same valley I had, and men who have survived that kind of war develop a particular fluency in reading old wounds. "Were you in the Cav?" he asked slowly. "First Cav, 71, Central Highlands?" The room went quiet. Even Ivy, in her high chair, seemed to sense the shift, her small hands stilling around a piece of bread. "I was," I said. "March the 9th, Thomas said, and his voice was starting to shake now, in a way that had nothing to do with age. "There was a medic. Carried me 400 yards through an ambush. Took 2 rounds doing it. I spent 40 years trying to find that man's name, and the Army records were a mess, half of them lost, and I gave up looking about 15 years ago because I figured maybe it was better that way, maybe some debts you just carry instead of settling." He was standing now, his chair pushed back, his hand pressed against the table for balance. "That was you," he said. It wasn't a question anymore. "Harold, that was you who carried me." I stood up too, slowly, the way a 76-year-old body insists on doing everything now, and Thomas Whitmore crossed the small distance of that dining room and embraced me the way men embrace each other, only a handful of times in a life, completely, without any self-consciousness, 40 years of unspoken gratitude arriving all at once. "You told me she'd wait for me," he said into my shoulder, his voice breaking. "I didn't even know if I believed you. I was in so much pain I could barely hear you. But you kept saying it, over and over, the whole way to the chopper. She'll wait, she'll wait. Keep your eyes open, she'll wait." And she did. 49 years married this June, 2 daughters, 5 grandchildren. All of it, every bit of the life I got to have, happened because you didn't put me down in that field. I didn't have words for a long moment. Carol used to say that was the one thing that never changed about me after the war, that the biggest moments always seemed to arrive when I had the fewest words available to meet them. "I never knew your name either," I finally managed. "Army didn't exactly do a great job keeping medics informed about who survived and who didn't. I've wondered about you for 51 years, Thomas, wondered if I'd done enough." "You did more than enough," he said. "You did everything." Rachel had gone very still in her chair, her hand pressed against her mouth, looking between her father and me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not the guarded caution from the playground, but something raw and unguarded, the particular vertigo of realizing you've fundamentally misjudged someone. "Dad," she said quietly, to her own father, "you never told me any of this story." "I never told anyone the man's name," Thomas said, still gripping my shoulder like he needed the physical confirmation that I was real, "because I never knew it. I just knew there was a medic out there somewhere who carried me 400 yards and probably never thought twice about it again, and I always hoped, wherever he was, that his life turned out okay." He turned to me. "Did it turn out okay?" I thought about Carol, 42 years of marriage. I thought about Daniel, imperfect and quiet like his father, but a good man. I thought about Ivy, 7 months old, who I had held exactly once in public before her mother, understandably, protectively, not knowing any of this, had pulled her back. "It turned out okay," I said. "It turned out better than I had any right to expect." Later that night, after Thomas and his wife had gone home, and Daniel had taken Ivy up for her bath, Rachel found me sitting alone on the back porch, in the same kind of quiet I'd occupied for most of my adult life. She sat down beside me without asking, which was new. She had always kept a careful, polite distance in the 2 years I'd known her, and the absence of that distance now felt significant. "I owe you an apology," she said, "at the playground. I was overprotective and unfair, and I judged you based on nothing at all except that I didn't know you, and instead of getting to know you, I just decided to be cautious in the laziest possible way." "You didn't know," I said. "That's not laziness, Rachel. That's just, you only had the parts of me that were visible." "My dad talked about that medic for years," she said. "Not often, maybe once every couple of years. Usually after a few drinks at a family reunion, he'd get quiet and mention there was a man he never got to properly thank. I used to think it was just, I don't know, an old war story he liked to tell. I never understood it was a debt he was actually still carrying. And it turns out that man was sitting at my in-laws' dinner table this whole time, and I wouldn't even let him hold my daughter at a playground because I thought he seemed too quiet to trust." She was crying now, quietly, the particular tears of someone confronting how small their assumptions had been compared to the actual size of a person's life. "I'm not telling you all this so you'll feel guilty," I said. "You made a reasonable choice with the information you had. I could have told Daniel this story 30 years ago and made it easier on everyone. That's on me as much as anyone." "Why didn't you?" she asked. "Tell people, I mean. Harold, it's an extraordinary thing you did. Why keep it so quiet for 50 years? I thought about that question for a long moment, watching the porch light attract a small cluster of moths against the dark. "Because the men who didn't come home don't get to tell their stories," I said finally. And for a long time, telling mine felt like taking up space that should have belonged to them instead. I carried 3 men out of that valley over 11 months. I lost 2 others I couldn't get to in time. It never felt like a story about heroism to me, Rachel. It always just felt like the worst days of my life, and I didn't see the value in reliving them at dinner parties. Rachel reached over and took my hand, my left hand, the one with the old scar running along the forearm, and held it the way you hold something you've only just understood the value of. "Will you hold Ivy tomorrow?" she asked. "At the playground, properly, however long you want." "I'd like that very much," I said. The following Saturday, we went back to the same playground, and I sat on the same bench, and Rachel handed me her daughter without a single moment of hesitation, and I held Ivy against my chest while she gummed contentedly at a teething ring, and nobody in that park had any idea that the quiet old man on the bench had once carried a dying stranger 400 yards through gunfire and never let go until the job was finished. Nobody needed to know, really. That was never the point. The point, I came to understand over the following months, was simply that the people closest to me, my own family, deserved to know the fuller shape of who I was, not because it made me more impressive, but because withholding it had cost us something. 2 years of Rachel's caution, and God knows how many small moments of connection Daniel and I might have shared if I'd simply told him the truth decades earlier, instead of protecting him, and myself, from a story I thought was too heavy to set down at an ordinary dinner table. Daniel and I talk more now. Not constantly, we're still, both of us, men who prefer quiet over lengthy conversation, but there is a different quality to the silences between us now, a companionship in them rather than a distance. He asked me, a few months after that dinner, whether I'd be willing to talk to a local high school history class about my service. I said yes, which surprised us both. Thomas and I see each other regularly now. 2 old men who share a debt that can never quite be repaid, only honored, over coffee every few weeks, telling each other the parts of that war neither of us had ever told anyone else. Ivy turned 1 this past spring, and at her birthday party, surrounded by both sides of her family in Daniel and Rachel's backyard, Thomas stood up with a glass in his hand and asked for everyone's attention. "I want to say something about my granddaughter's other grandfather," he said, and the yard went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when someone signals that what's coming matters. 51 years ago, this man saved my life in a rice paddy in a war most of you weren't alive for. I spent 40 years looking for him and never found him. And it turned out he was waiting the whole time, 3 miles from where I've lived for the last decade, quietly delivering mail and raising a son, and saying nothing at all about the bravest morning of his life. I got 49 years with my wife because of him. I got 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren because of him. And now, because of the strangest, most improbable kindness life has ever handed me, my granddaughter and his granddaughter are the same little girl. He raised his glass toward me, and I felt Ivy's small hand patting my cheek from where I held her, entirely unbothered by any of the adult emotions swirling around her first birthday party. "To Harold," Thomas said, his voice thick, "the quietest hero I've ever known, and the man who made sure I got to be here for all of this. I think often now about that afternoon at the playground, about Rachel's hand extended toward her daughter, the caution in her eyes, the assumption she made based on nothing more than my quiet, unremarkable exterior. I don't hold it against her. I understand it, the way I understand that most of us walk through the world reading each other by surface alone, because surface is usually all we're given. But I think the real lesson of this story isn't about medals, or war, or even about the particular impossible coincidence of Thomas Whitmore's daughter marrying my son. The real lesson is smaller and quieter than that, and it's this: the people we underestimate, the quiet ones, the unremarkable ones, the ones who never volunteer their own history, are so often carrying entire lifetimes we never bothered to ask about. Somewhere behind every ordinary face is a story large enough to reshape how you see them, if only you gave them the chance, or the safety, to tell it. I held Ivy in public plenty of times after that, but it was never really about the holding. It was about a family finally understanding the fuller shape of the man who'd been sitting quietly at their table all along, waiting, the way I suppose I'd always been waiting, for someone to simply ask. Subscribe to Silent Honor for new stories every week, real strength, quiet dignity, and the moments when the truth finally speaks louder than years of silence. Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatized story created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental.